Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write science fiction, horror, and fantasy, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I am traveling. I'm actually teaching at a writing conference in Colorado Springs called Writing Superstars, and it's great. That's why it's a different background. I'm in a hotel room, but I still wanted to make sure to post a review today, and so I brought with me my copy of Emerald Empire, which is the first and most important supplement for the new 5th edition of Legend of the Five Rings. The core book has all of the rules of how to play the game. Emerald Empire is the book that has all of the vital cultural and setting information that makes Rokugan the rich and incredible game world that it is. You don't need it, I guess, to play, but you want it. You should absolutely get it. You totally need it. It's an incredibly valuable book. In the 4th edition, it was a must buy. In the 5th edition, definitely still a must buy. So we're going to go through it. I don't have a PDF, so I'm just going to be showing you copies of the physical book and showing you some pages in there. I'm not going to go into huge detail and everything, but I do want to give you a sense of what is in the book and why it is so important. The main thing this book will give you, like I said, is setting info and details. Some incredible, down to the nitty-gritty kind of details. Rokugan is a game world in which culture matters. Manners and etiquette and the way that you do things is as important as the things that you do. The way that you talk to people, depending on their status and your status in relation to them, is different. The way that you will interact with an imperial court or a city or a merchant or a peasant, things like that matter in this world. And while you can definitely easily gloss over them and play the game however you want to play it, I do think that there's a lot of value and a lot of enjoyment to be had by really immersing yourself in the very rich world of Rokugan. So, Emerald Empire, we're going to get into it now. The prologue for the book has what is called, it basically just gives a history, a very kind of brief overview of the 1,200 or so years of history that Rokugan has behind it. And it makes the point, and I thought this was a delightful point to make, that this is an official Rokugani history, which does not mean it's true. It just means that that's what everybody is told is true and accepts as truth within the Empire of Rokugan. Outside, if you're dealing with one of the Ivory Kingdoms or some of the other Gaijin, they absolutely might have a different interpretation. And in fact, different groups and clans or kind of cults and secret organizations within Rokugan might also have a different official version of history and what they believe to be true. But anyway, that's our first little, I got a bunch of bookmarks here. So we start with this kind of cool classic Japanese style artwork there, and then it goes through from the very foundation kind of creation of the world all the way down to the modern day. And this will get into important things that have happened throughout history. Why is this the way it is? Why are the Crab Clan the way they are? Why do the Crab Clan refer to the Daidoji family of the crane as the Iron Cranes, and why do they give them so much respect? Who is Fu Leng? Where did the Meiho come from? All of these questions that you may have about the history of Rokugan, they're all in here, and there's a lot of rich detail. So there is great. Now the next chapter is castles, and one of the things that this book does, it's not only filled with kind of cultural and setting information, but it has a ton of really great maps. This is a map of a castle, a fairly small castle. The larger ones, the Imperial Castle of Otosan Uchi is actually 10 stories tall. This one is 4, if you count the observatory on the peak of the roof. And so it's relatively small, but it gives you a sense of what is inside of a castle. And then the book will also go through and talks about, and this is true of every chapter as well, and we'll be seeing it a lot, when it gets into specific castles, and for every specific castle that it talks about, it is going to provide some rumors, which are right here, and it's going to do adventure hooks, and then it is going to actually give a character as well. And so throughout the book, we'll be seeing that. Right now, we're talking about these specific castles. And one point that it makes about castles, and one of the reasons that knowing the cultural details of Rokugan is valuable, is, for example, the social rigidity of Rokugani culture affects the way that castles work. So, for example, most of the walls inside of a castle are paper screens, and it is considered culturally important that you ignore everything you overhear through a paper screen. You have to just pretend like you didn't hear it. And that makes it, that allows things to be quote unquote private if you have a conversation inside a castle. Someone else definitely might have heard it, and they might even act on that information, but they would never in 1,000 years admit that they had heard it, because that would be an admission of eavesdropping, which is such a massive breach of cultural etiquette that it would destroy any value they gain from having overheard you in the first place. Now, that's one level of this, but that social rigidity carries forward into fans, because paper screens and walls are considered private. This extends to paper fans. And so if you fold out a paper fan and cover your mouth with it, that is a clear cultural sign to everybody else in the room that you're having a private conversation, and they have to pretend they didn't hear you. But they probably totally do anyway, which is a way also of sharing information that you're not supposed to have shared. And under the guise of a pretext, under that pretext of a private conversation, and you cover your mouth with a fan and you very loudly stage whisper to the courtier next to you some important secret. Everyone in the room now knows that secret, but it can never be traced back to you as the source officially, because that would be an admission that they had been eavesdropping on a private conversation. So there's some very cool details that you get from the culture and things that you can do in this setting that don't really make sense in any other role-playing setting, at least that I'm aware of. The chapters, the chapter on courts also gets into, on castles also gets into courts. How does a court work? Why is a court important? There are 2 major forms of conflict in the Rokugani setting. And one is war, which is just outright, we're going to kill you with our swords. And then there is court. And court is every bit as important and dangerous as war. But the weapons, of course, are words. And this chapter gets into both of those and talks about some of the specific ones that have happened. There's a really great section talking about a castle called Toshiranbo, which is relatively small. I think it's maybe 4 stories tall. And like I said, that's not even in the upper half of the great and glorious castles, but it's a politically important one because it's a place where the lion and the crane have been fighting for generations, for hundreds of years, and so it has an outsized political importance. And there's just 4 or 5 specific castles with stories and adventure hooks like that then you can use to just straight up play those adventure hooks, or you can extrapolate your own castles and say, oh well, this inspires me to do my own thing and create my own castle or my own form of court intrigue. So really great stuff in that chapter. Chapter 2 then is about cities. And just like we got a great map of a castle, they give us a great map of a city. I really like the art style in this edition of the book, this kind of stylized, almost storybook watercolor things. So this, again, is a relatively small city, but it is just an example of this is the kind of thing that's in a city. This is what the cities look like. And then the chapter goes on to say, well, if you're in a city, what are you going to do there? What are your, how are your samurai going to talk to people? How do they interact with merchants? Given the way that social hierarchies work in Rokugani culture, can your samurai even talk to a merchant? Well, depends on their own social status. Um, there is a significant section in here which talks about harbors and ports, which are a really big deal in Rokugan because, as you can see from the map of, let's see, am I showing? There we go. The map of Rokugan, the vast majority of the really important cities are coastal. And there's definitely some inland stuff, but even those are along rivers. And there's another chapter that talks about rivers and roads. But harbors and ports are a big, important thing. And in particular, it talks about the Mantis. In the fourth edition of the game, Mantis were considered a great clan. In fifth edition, they're not. They're still a minor clan, but they're the clan that lives out in the islands off the coast. They're the ones that kind of unofficially trade with Gaijin. Gaijin means foreigners. Foreigners are not allowed in the Emerald Empire at all by order of the emperor, and that's been hundreds of years since that has been the case. But the Mantis will kind of unofficially deal with them anyway, as a form of trade and such. And so the Mantis have their importance. They also have a really cool castle in here that's described as well, called Kyuden Gote. Anyway, the section on cities also talks about law and crime, and it makes another interesting cultural point about the difference between testimony and evidence. In most Rokugani cities, cultures, places, testimony is considered the ultimate form of evidence. That if somebody has done something wrong, the highest status witness who can say, yes, this person did something wrong, well, that's true. And that is the celestial order of things. And the idea that physical evidence could be used to contradict the word of a samurai is considered, even by some people, to be blasphemous. Not only incorrect, but an absolute, slap in the face of the celestial order and the laws of Bushido. Which is risky, because one of the core schools, one of the core kind of character classes in the core book is the Kitsuki investigator, someone who is going around and looking for evidence and trying to find evidence of crimes. And there's always the risk that if they show up in a court and say, this person is lying and I can prove it because of these, footprints in the sand or whatever, well, suddenly you're saying that footprints in the sand are contradicting, that you're calling this other samurai a liar, and especially if that person has higher status than you, then it's a whole thing, and it has a big section on the difference between a testimony and evidence and how you can determine right and wrong and enforce the laws. Lots of great stuff in that chapter as well. Chapter 3 talks about rural life. And this is where we get into some other cities. So there are some, we've talked about the big cities. Now we get to talk about little villages. And as with the castles, as with the cities, the villages and the way stations and the roads, there's specific examples, 3 or 4 of each, with rumors, adventure hooks, and a little sample character that you can interact with that has, the basic stats printed out. And one of the ones that I really love, again, of course, there's a really cool map for it. There's a way station on the road. A hooray for this way station map. And those maps, this one comes with the Lost Monk Road station. It has an adventure hook there about the black market, and there's interesting characters you can interact with. And all of these, like I said, are designed for you to use them as is and then come up with your own ideas based on these almost templates, based on these examples. Chapter 4 talks about religion. And religion is where we're really starting to get into the cosmology of Rokugan. What do they believe about the universe? Where do they think that they came from? How do the gods work? The kami, the fortunes, all of these different things. The kami are basically gods and spirits, and the fortunes are very important ones because they are spirits that represent not a specific place, but a specific concept. And so even in the core book, there are a ton of advantages and disadvantages that relate to the fortunes. If a particular fortune smiles on you, then you will have some kind of blessing related to the concept that they are in charge of. If that same kami instead doesn't like you, well, then you can have all kinds of trouble, which is also a bad thing. In this section on religion, it also talks about superstition. And it gets down, like I talked about in the beginning, with detail. This gets down into clan by clan. What are some representative superstitions that they hold? And my favorite one by far, and again, like I said in my core book review, I'm kind of a Dragon Clan guy at heart. One of the Dragon Clan superstitions, it lists a few of them. Then at the end it says, note that Dragon Clan monks, one of their favorite pastimes is to invent new superstitions and share them with the peasants and see which ones catch on, which is totally the kind of cheeky, mischievous Dragon Clan thing, and I love it. This one gets into specific shrines and temples and talks about, the hooks and rumors and adventures that can happen in those, gives some examples and lets you come up with your own. And it makes the point that even the bad spirits, even the malicious or malevolent kami, still have shrines. One of the really important ones is there's a fortune of pestilence. Most of the fortunes are for good things. There's a fortune of pestilence, and there's absolutely a shrine to that fortune, and people will give them stuff, because if we don't give you your proper due, well, then you're going to come and take it yourself. And we definitely don't want the fortune of pestilence to show up and start taking its due. So lots of good stuff there. Chapter 5 follows this discussion of religion with a discussion of enlightenment, which is where we're getting into monks and monasteries and that kind of thing. One thing that I really appreciated about this chapter is that it has a huge sidebar. It actually takes up most of the page that talks about real world beliefs and practices and religions. And it, given that this is so heavily based on Japanese mythology and Japanese ideas and culture, it's really good, I think, that they make the point. And they say, don't use stereotypes. They actually come right out, and I hope nobody actually has to hear this, but I know that it is important to say, don't use fake, Asian sounding accents when you're playing. Don't use mockeries of actual real world practices. Just because they have a monastic order called Shinsei that is kind of based on Buddhism, Buddhism is a real religion that real people adhere to and believe in. And so when you're using this game version of it, don't make fun of it. Don't incorporate real Buddhist prayers or rituals into your game, because we don't want to offend people. We don't want to drive people away. We don't want to mock people or make fun of them. And and so I was really glad that they included that in there. Games should be a way of bringing people together and of celebrating ideas that we like, not a way of appropriating other cultures or making fun of them. And so I was really glad to see that in there. Good for them. Shinsei is kind of, I mean, I said Buddhist, it's almost more Taoist than that, but it's a very important part of Rokugani culture. The legends about Shinsei himself, and then also the kind of path to enlightenment and the monastic order that has sprung up around him. So, as with the other chapters, it talks about a bunch of different temples and then a bunch of different shrines and a bunch of different monasteries, getting down into the specifics of each one. How does it work? What are the rumors surrounding it? What are the adventure hooks? Gives a little person that can apply to each one, so that there's an NPC you can interact with, and then you can spin that off into your own adventures, and that's great. Chapter 6 talks about the wilderness. And there was another wonderful cultural detail in here. I love pointing these out because I really do think that the culture of Rokugan is a huge part of why the game is so great. And so, for example, one of the tenets of Bushido, one of the things that an honorable samurai will always do, is they will avoid touching dead things, right? Which makes wilderness survival very difficult. If you live in a city or a castle and you have servants around that can, skin your cows to make leather, that they can kill animals and prepare food, that's great. Once it becomes food, it's not a dead thing anymore. It's food, and I, as a samurai, can touch it. If I have to survive in the wilderness by myself, we're eventually going to reach a point where I need to either touch a dead thing to eat it and prepare it myself, or starve to death. And that becomes then not just a survival, not just a physical problem, but a moral one. What is your samurai going to do when confronted with that situation? And so, even out in the wilderness, far away from the trappings of culture, the culture still matters, and it can still apply in some surprising and cool ways that make for great storytelling. So the chapter on wilderness is great. It talks about specifics, specific mountains, specific forests. There's even a section on ruins, 2 or 3 complexes of ruins, where, for example, there's one of them where some bandits came long, long in the past to try to steal all the stuff from a shrine, and this monk refused to give it to them, and so they burned it down, and the monk just sat there and meditated, and he didn't make a sound the whole time. And the bandits were kind of scared by this, and also kind of in awe and reverence of the sacrifice this monk was willing to make, and so they left. And the town was saved. And now the ruins of that shrine are still there, and you can go, and there's adventure hooks and rumors and NPCs that you can interact with for all of these mountains and ruins and forests and all of these things. And so there's a lot of really cool setting information in addition to the cultural stuff. Last of all, chapter 7, I've talked the rest of this stuff up so much, but honestly, chapter 7 might be the very first place that most people turn, because that is where the player options show up. That is where the new game rules. There's a bunch of new advantages and disadvantages, the passions and the anxieties and all of these things, the blessings and curses and whatever. There's a bunch of new ones, but even more so than that, there's new families and new schools, which are like the backgrounds. What in another game would be your race and your class, in L5R it's your family and your school. And we've already covered in the core book all of the great clans. What this one has is the imperial families, which are awesome. They're not the great clans, but they hold, as their name implies, most of the major political power in the empire. And so there's 4 imperial families. There's a ton of imperial schools. There's also several schools relating to monks, to go along with the religion and enlightenment chapters. And there's even two schools that I thought were super fantastic. There is a, where is it? The Kitsune Impersonator. The Kitsune is like a fox spirit. You can actually just play a fox spirit pretending to be a person, and they have an option for that now if you buy this book. They also have a Kolot Saboteur. I don't know how well you can read that. The Kolot are one of my favorite villain groups in the in Rokugan. They were I made them into the major villains of the massive like 3-year campaign that I ran in 4th edition. The Kolot are kind of a group of evil bankers, I guess is what they are. They are trying to control things behind the scenes and manipulate everybody. And they have a shinobi kind of underhanded sneaky ninja saboteur class. So you can be part of the Kolot school now, which I assume will be secret, and you won't tell anyone you're one of the Kolot, but the option is there now. So Emerald Empire, absolutely indispensable book in my opinion if you are playing Legend of the Five Rings 5th edition. So much information from the esoteric historical stuff to the intriguing cultural stuff down to the nitty-gritty, what can I actually use in my game? Here's new player options, here's adventure hooks. It has everything in it. It's an absolutely phenomenal book. So, L5R, 5th edition, Emerald Empire. Grab a copy, and I will see you in another review. Bye!